From the very first day, my mother-in-law made it clear I was nothing, useless, a burden she couldn't tolerate. My husband stayed silent, watching as her words cut deeper than any knife. I tried to survive, to obey, to stay invisible. But then my father's secret letter changed everything. And what happened next completely shocked them. Chapter 1. The Day She Broke Me. I remember the first time I felt the full weight of my mother-in-law's contempt. It was my wedding day. The day I should have been celebrated, cherished, and welcomed into her family. Instead, I was a shadow at the edge of the room, invisible and unworthy in her eyes. She didn't hide it. She called me useless in front of everyone, suggesting that I had nothing to offer her son, that I would never be able to manage a household, and that I was lucky he had married me at all. I tried to smile, tried to brush off her words, tried to tell myself that they were just cruel jokes, but deep inside, each word sank like a stone in my chest. My husband didn't defend me. He didn't look at her and tell her that her words were cruel. He simply stayed silent, nodding politely as if agreeing that I was, indeed, useless. That silence hurt more than her insults ever could. I felt isolated, trapped, and powerless. I wanted to run, to escape, to hide in the one place that felt safe, my father's home. But even then, I couldn't leave. The expectations, the promises, the social pressure, they kept me in place, pretending to be the obedient wife, while my self-esteem quietly eroded. Each day, I found myself performing tasks I had never been trained to do: cooking, cleaning, managing a household I had only imagined in my dreams, while my mother-in-law watched every move with sharp criticism. "You call that cleaning?" she asked one morning, glaring at the kitchen. "My daughter-in-law could do this faster. You will never be good enough." I wanted to disappear. I wanted the earth to swallow me whole. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that her opinion didn't define me, but I couldn't. I didn't have the strength. I didn't have the words. All I had was fear, and the growing realization that I had married into a house where I was constantly being measured, judged, and found lacking. Then, one evening, I received a letter from my father. A letter he had written months before I got married, secretly tucked away for emergencies. He knew I might face challenges, he had written, and he had a plan to ensure that my voice would one day be heard, even if no one else listened. I held the envelope in my trembling hands, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time since the wedding. That night, I couldn't sleep. I read the letter over and over, absorbing my father's words, his love, his trust, and his unwavering belief in me. He had left instructions for a lawyer, a secret he had prepared, something that could one day protect me from those who sought to diminish my worth. As I read, I realized that my helplessness was temporary. There was a way to reclaim my life, a way to show my mother-in-law and perhaps even my husband that I was not useless. But it would require patience. It would require strategy. And it would require courage I had not yet fully discovered. Over the next few weeks, I started small. I quietly learned more about managing the household, improving my cooking, understanding finances, and even documenting everything she criticized. I realized that her power came from my silence, from my fear, and from my belief that her words defined me. The moment I stopped letting them define me, I began to see opportunities. I also began to secretly consult the lawyer my father had mentioned, learning about the rights I had, the steps I could take, and the legal protections that would one day empower me. Every meeting was a small act of rebellion, a quiet step toward the life I deserved. I knew the day would come when her insults would not just bounce off me, they would backfire. That day, the first spark of hope ignited. I began to believe, for the first time, that I could be more than useless. I could be smart, capable, and resilient. And one day, my mother-in-law's words would not just fail to hurt me, they would be irrelevant, drowned out by the life I had built on my own terms. And that day, I vowed, would come sooner than she expected. After reading my father's letter that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: hope. It was fragile, flickering like a candle in a storm, but it was there. And I knew that if I wanted to survive and eventually thrive, I had to start taking control, even if it meant hiding my plans from everyone around me. The first step was small but significant. I began documenting everything my mother-in-law said and did: her criticisms, her manipulations, her public humiliations. At first, it felt almost silly, like keeping a diary for my own sanity. But I remembered my father's words: knowledge is power. If she tried to claim I was incompetent or unworthy, I would have evidence to show the truth. Meanwhile, I had to endure her constant scrutiny. Every meal, every chore, every conversation felt like a test I was destined to fail. "Why can you do anything right?" she would snap, and my husband would, as always, remain silent. I clenched my jaw and smiled politely, hiding the growing fire inside me. For years, I had allowed her words to define me, but no longer. I also began secretly consulting the lawyer mentioned in my father's letter. At first, I felt nervous, almost guilty, about seeking legal advice against my own family, but the lawyer reassured me gently. "Your father left this for a reason. You have the right to protect yourself and to ensure your voice is heard." Each meeting with him gave me clarity and courage. I learned about my rights regarding property, inheritance, and household responsibilities, everything my mother-in-law tried to control. While I worked quietly on my plan, I also started reclaiming small parts of my life within the house. I cooked meals exactly how I liked, redecorated my space, and even quietly organized finances to ensure I had some independent access. These small acts felt like tiny victories, and with each one, my confidence grew. I realized that independence wasn't just about money or legal rights. It was about asserting my identity, refusing to let her define me. Of course, she noticed, the slightest changes in my behavior: subtle confidence, quiet assertiveness, small accomplishments made her uneasy. One evening, she cornered me in the kitchen, glaring. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed. I looked her directly in the eye and smiled faintly, hiding the truth. I was smarter than she would ever know. I had a plan, and she had no idea how close I was to the tipping point. As weeks passed, my strategy began to take shape. I combined my secret legal preparations with small, calculated moves within the household. I learned which arguments would make her doubt herself, which conversations could subtly shift the power dynamic, and which moments required patience. Each day, I became more adept at navigating her cruelty while quietly preparing my escape and eventual triumph. And then came the first real test of my plan. She had invited her friends over to criticize me in public, as she often did. I felt the familiar pang of fear and embarrassment, but I reminded myself of my father's letter, of the lawyer's guidance, of the growing strength inside me. I did not falter. I served them with calm efficiency, answered her questions politely but confidently, and refused to be drawn into arguments. The shock on her face when she realized I was no longer afraid was exhilarating. It was a small victory, but an important one. I realized that her power had always depended on my fear. Remove the fear, and her words became hollow, meaningless. I had taken the first true step toward reclaiming my life. That night, alone in my room, I reread my father's letter. "You are stronger than you know," it said. And for the first time, I truly believed it. I was ready to take the next step, to move from small victories to decisive actions that would change everything. The mother-in-law who called me useless had no idea that her own words would fuel my rise. I was no longer the timid, powerless girl she had once dismissed. I was becoming someone she would soon fear, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through undeniable proof of my capability, intelligence, and resilience. And I knew, with unwavering certainty, that the day would come when the lawyer would read my father's letter aloud, and everything she had tried to crush would come alive, reclaiming its rightful place. By now, my confidence was growing, but the fear of my mother-in-law's wrath was still very real. I had been careful, strategic, and patient, but I knew the day would come when I couldn't hide my newfound strength any longer. That day arrived sooner than I expected. Began with something small, a disagreement over the household budget. I had quietly allocated some funds for a project I had been dreaming about, a small business that could provide me independence. I didn't tell anyone, of course. My mother-in-law noticed the change in our finances almost immediately and was furious. "You think you can manage money better than me?" she demanded, her voice sharp and dripping with condescension. "You're useless. You will ruin everything you touch." For a moment my old fear surged. My hands trembled, my heart raced, and I felt the familiar urge to apologize, to shrink, to be invisible. But then I remembered my father's letter, the lawyer's advice, and all the preparation I had done. I straightened my shoulders, looked her directly in the eye, and spoke clearly. "No," I said calmly. "I want to ruin anything. Ivy planned carefully, and I know exactly what I am doing. I am taking responsibility, just like you expect me to." She blinked, clearly taken aback by my firmness. My husband, as always, remained silent, watching the exchange with a mixture of surprise and unease. I realized in that moment that my words had shifted the power dynamic. I was no longer the timid, powerless girl who had married into this household. I had a voice, and I would use it. Over the next few days, I began subtly asserting myself more. I took initiative in household decisions, planned meals and schedules with efficiency, and even politely questioned her authority when necessary. Each time, she tried to belittle me, but I held my ground. Every word she used against me became fuel for my determination. Meanwhile, I continued working quietly on my larger plan with the lawyer. I gathered documents, prepared evidence, and made sure every step I took could be legally supported. I knew that one day, this preparation would pay off in a way she could never have imagined. The tension in the house was palpable. My mother-in-law, who had once ruled with an iron fist, now faced resistance she didn't understand. Her criticisms became sharper, her tone harsher, but I no longer wavered. I had discovered the power of calm confidence, the ability to respond without anger, without fear, and without giving her the satisfaction of seeing me broken. One evening, the confrontation reached its peak. She called me into the living room, flanked by relatives visiting for dinner. Her voice was dripping with disdain. "You think you can be smart? You think you can manage anything?" she sneered. "You're useless, and you will never be more than that." For a moment, I felt the old familiar fear. But then I took a deep breath, straightened my back, and held up a document. "My father prepared this for me," I said steadily, passing the envelope to the lawyer I had invited discreetly. "It explains everything you doubt about me, my capability, my rights, and my place in this family. Please read it aloud." The room fell silent. My mother-in-law's eyes widened as the lawyer opened the envelope. As he began reading, detailing my father's words, instructions, and validation of my competence, I saw the shock and disbelief on her face. The very woman who had called me useless was now hearing irrefutable proof that I was capable, deserving, and prepared. It was a moment of revelation, not just for her, but for me. I realized that patience, preparation, and inner strength could turn humiliation into empowerment. I was no longer powerless. I was no longer defined by her words. I was finally taking my place in the world, on my own terms. That night, after everyone had left, I sat quietly in my room, absorbing what had just happened. For the first time in years, I felt proud not for revenge, not for proving anyone wrong, but for reclaiming my own worth. I knew this was only the beginning, but it was a powerful beginning, a turning point in a story that had once seemed hopeless. After the lawyer read my father a secret letter aloud, the atmosphere in the house changed subtly at first, then unmistakably. My mother-in-law, who had ruled every corner of this home with sharp words and sharper eyes, suddenly seemed uncertain. For the first time, I felt her power waver, and it was intoxicating. At first, she tried to regain control with her usual tactics: snide comments, sarcastic remarks, and attempts to manipulate my husband into chastising me. "You don't know how to manage this family?" she whispered one evening when she thought I wasn't listening. "You'll regret thinking you were clever." But I was no longer the same woman she had dismissed. I had prepared carefully, learned my rights, and built quiet resilience over weeks. Instead of panicking or apologizing, I simply smiled, letting her words bounce off me. Silence, I realized, was more powerful than arguments. By refusing to engage in her attempts to provoke fear or guilt, I began to reclaim authority over my own life. My husband, who had always remained silent, started noticing the change. I saw the tension in his eyes as he watched me calmly manage household disputes and make decisions he once assumed I couldn't. For the first time, he seemed unsure of where I stood, and that uncertainty worked in my favor. I began to make small but deliberate changes in the household. I organized finances, scheduled meals and chores efficiently, and even started planning my own side projects. These moves were quiet, almost invisible to the casual observer, but they were part of a larger strategy: to show, slowly but undeniably, that I was capable, competent, and independent. One evening, my mother-in-law attempted her usual public humiliation. She gathered a few relatives and whispered criticisms about me while everyone ate. I felt the familiar pang of fear, but this time I stood my ground. I calmly responded to her inquiries, showcasing my knowledge and organization. The room went silent. Her relatives exchanged surprised glances, and for the first time I saw hesitation in her eyes. The lawyer said involvement had been critical. I had left the letter and documentation in his hands as a safety net, and the knowledge that my father's words validated my competence gave me confidence I had never felt before. I realized that empowerment was not just about standing up in the moment, it was about preparation, strategy, and knowing that I had undeniable proof on my side. Over the next few weeks, the power shift became more pronounced. My mother-in-law's criticisms grew sharper, but they no longer shook me. I responded with calm explanations, gentle corrections, and occasional silence, which seemed to frustrate her more than any argument ever could. Slowly, the household began to recognize my capabilities. Even my husband, who had always been indifferent or passive, started relying on my judgment in subtle ways. The small victories accumulated. I organized a family event flawlessly, managed a complex household expense dispute, and even mediated minor disagreements between relatives. Each success strengthened my confidence and made my mother-in-law's insults less potent. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer useless. I was becoming indispensable, and she could sense it. One afternoon, I found her staring at me from across the kitchen, her expression a mixture of disbelief and begrudging respect. "You've changed," she muttered, but I only smiled faintly. I didn't need her approval. I didn't need her acknowledgement. I only needed the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had taken my first major steps toward reclaiming my life. That night, I reflected on how far I had come. I had gone from trembling at her words to calmly asserting myself in the face of manipulation. I had transformed fear into strategy, humiliation into quiet triumph. And I realized that the life my father had envisioned for me, a life where I was respected, empowered, and independent, was finally within reach. I knew the ultimate test was yet to come. My mother-in-law would not give up easily. She would try harder, manipulate smarter, and push boundaries further. But I was ready. Each challenge she threw at me would only strengthen me further. And when the time was right, I would show her and everyone watching that the woman she called useless was now unshakable, unstoppable, and victorious. By the time Chapter 5 arrived, I had begun to sense a subtle but undeniable shift in the household. My mother-in-law, who had spent years trying to make me feel worthless, was now cautious. Every word she spoke was measured, every glance calculated. I could feel her realizing that the timid, obedient girl she had thought she controlled was gone, and in her place stood a woman she had underestimated, composed, intelligent, and unstoppable. The change didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, built on small victories I had quietly accumulated, organizing the household finances, managing family gatherings flawlessly, mediating disputes, and handling responsibilities she had always claimed were beyond my capability. Each small success chipped away at her authority, slowly replacing her fear with frustration. Then came the first major turning point, a family meeting where she had intended to publicly humiliate me. I knew about it in advance. The lawyer had advised me to document the proceedings for my own protection. Normally, her gatherings were opportunities to assert dominance, to remind everyone I was useless. But this time, I was prepared. As the meeting began, she started her usual barrage of criticism. "You don't understand how to manage this family," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're inexperienced. You're incompetent. You will never be respected here." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. The nerves were still there, but now they were paired with a growing determination. I calmly responded, outlining the processes I had implemented, demonstrating my competence, and showing how my actions had improved the household's functioning. My words were precise, clear, and unshakable. The relatives in the room watched in stunned silence. I could see the surprise and admiration in their eyes. And I saw it too, the disbelief on my mother-in-law's face. She tried to interrupt, tried to regain control, but every time she spoke, I answered calmly, confidently, without raising my voice. Her frustration was palpable. It was during this meeting that the lawyer subtly handed her the envelope with my father's secret letter. The room went quiet as he began reading it aloud. The words detailed my father's trust in me, his validation of my intelligence and capability, and his instructions for protecting my rights. The relatives listened intently, and my mother-in-law's face turned pale. The woman who had once ruled this household with sharp words and scorn now had no defense. I felt a strange mix of emotions: vindication, relief, and a deep sense of empowerment. I realized that the humiliation I had endured for so long was no longer relevant. The narrative had shifted. I was no longer defined by her cruelty. I was defined by my strength, my preparation, and the life I was building. After that meeting, the atmosphere in the household changed significantly. My mother-in-law became quieter, more cautious. She could no longer manipulate, belittle, or intimidate me with ease. I had claimed my place, not with anger or vengeance, but with dignity, intelligence, and strategic action. Over the next few weeks, I continued to assert myself in subtle but undeniable ways. I organized events, managed finances, and took initiative in decision-making, all while maintaining a calm, composed demeanor. Each step strengthened my confidence and reinforced the shift in the household dynamics. One evening, as I completed another successfully executed family event, my husband approached me. I, I didn't realize you were capable of all this, he admitted quietly, almost hesitantly. I looked at him, steady and composed, and said softly, I've always been capable. I just needed the chance and the courage to show it. And in that moment, I understood something profound. Empowerment isn't just about winning arguments or proving someone wrong. It's about reclaiming your life, your dignity, and your self-worth. It's about turning the pain, criticism, and manipulation into fuel for growth. And that is exactly what I had done. The mother-in-law who once called me useless was still in the house, but her power over me was gone. I had begun to live on my own terms, and there was no turning back. The journey wasn't over, of course. There would be challenges ahead, moments when patience and strategy were tested. But for the first time, I felt in control, untouchable in my confidence, and unstoppable in my pursuit of a life that was truly mine. After the family meeting, I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. The tension that had constantly weighed me down, the fear, the humiliation, the feeling of worthlessness had lifted just enough for me to breathe freely. But I knew that reclaiming my life wasn't about a single confrontation. It was about creating a reality where I was respected, valued, and completely independent. I began by expanding my personal and professional world quietly, strategically. I invested in my small side business, which had been my father's suggestion all along. With his guidance encoded in that secret letter, I carefully learned how to manage finances, market products, and make smart decisions without anyone's interference. Slowly, my confidence grew as each small success reminded me that I was capable of far more than anyone had given me credit for, especially my mother-in-law. At home, I continued to assert myself calmly. I took responsibility for managing the household in ways that made my mother-in-law realize she could no longer control me. I organized schedules, delegated tasks efficiently, and even began subtly challenging outdated rules she had imposed over the years. Each time she tried to undermine me, but I met her manipulation with quiet confidence, refusing to rise to her provocations. Outside the house, I began to cultivate friendships and relationships that supported my growth. I found mentors, connected with like-minded women, and slowly built a network of people who respected me, my ideas, and my independence. For the first time, I felt supported not out of obligation, but out of genuine admiration. This support became a crucial pillar for my empowerment, reinforcing the lessons my father had left in that letter. One afternoon, I received an invitation to a professional event that I had dreamed of attending for years. It was an opportunity to showcase my talents, network, and prove to myself that I could thrive outside the shadow of my mother-in-law. I prepared meticulously, drawing on the discipline, resilience, and knowledge I had accumulated quietly over months. When the day arrived, I presented myself confidently, impressing peers and mentors alike. By the end of the event, I realized something profound. I was capable of more than survival. I was capable of thriving. At home, the dynamic had shifted further. My mother-in-law, who once dominated every room, now looked uneasy in my presence. Her sharp words became fewer, her critiques more hesitant. I could sense her frustration, the realization that her power over me had diminished significantly. Yet I did not gloat. I had learned that true empowerment doesn't require revenge. It requires focus, patience, and unwavering self-belief. My husband, meanwhile, began noticing the changes. He asked for my advice more often, observed my achievements, and slowly began to acknowledge the capabilities I had always possessed. While our relationship was complex, these moments reminded me that reclaiming my independence didn't require approval from others, it required action, resilience, and belief in myself. During these months, I also prepared for the final step, the legal protections and validations outlined in my Father's letter. I met with a lawyer, reviewed documents, and ensured that my future financial, personal, and professional was secure. Every preparation felt like a shield, a guarantee that no one could diminish the life I was building. By now, I had built a rhythm that empowered me both inside and outside the house. My mother-in-law's attempts to manipulate or belittle me were increasingly ineffective. I was no longer reacting out of fear or anger. I was acting with purpose, strategy, and clarity. Each action was a brick in the foundation of the life I had promised myself I would build. The most profound realization of all was that independence wasn't just about surviving the household, it was about cultivating a life that no one could intrude upon without my permission. The life I was building was mine, untouchable, and fully aligned with my values, dreams, and identity. And as I continued to expand my world, I felt a sense of peace and satisfaction I had never imagined possible. By the end of this chapter in my life, I understood the truth my father had tried to teach me all along. No one can define your worth but you. No one can dictate the life you deserve but you. And when you combine courage, preparation, and persistence, you can create a reality so strong, so fulfilling, and so untouchable that even the harshest critics become irrelevant. By now, I had become fully aware of the transformation I had undergone. The timid, self-doubting girl who once trembled at every word from my mother-in-law no longer existed. She had called me useless, tried to control my every move, and belittled my very existence, but none of that held power over me anymore. Not even a little. The shift became most evident during a family gathering, one that my mother-in-law had meticulously planned to showcase her authority and highlight my incompetence. Relatives had arrived, and she had positioned herself at the center, confident that I would falter under her scrutiny. This time, however, everything went differently. I entered the room with calm assurance, carrying myself in a way that made my presence undeniable. I had prepared every detail: meals, arrangements, schedules, and even entertainment. The family noticed immediately. Whispers spread admiration, surprise, curiosity. And my mother-in-law, who had expected me to crumble, looked unsettled. "You think you can manage all this?" she asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "I didn't just think," I replied, smiling faintly. "I planned, I executed, and it's all working smoothly." Everyone seems happy. Her eyes narrowed. "Lucky you," she muttered, clearly trying to downplay my success, but the room didn't agree. Relatives complimented me, sharing how well the event had gone, how smoothly everything had been handled. My mother-in-law could no longer manipulate their perception of me. The proof of my competence was undeniable. The satisfaction I felt was immense, but not because I wanted revenge. It was the quiet, profound realization that I had finally stepped into my own power. I was no longer defined by her words, no longer trapped in the cage of her expectations. I had built a life, a presence, and a reality she could not touch. Over the next few days, her behavior became more erratic. She attempted subtle criticisms, snide remarks, and manipulative tactics, but they all failed. I met them with calm reasoning, strategic silence, or gentle but firm rebuttals. She began to falter, visibly unsure of how to assert herself. For years, she had relied on fear and submission to maintain control, but now, both were gone. One evening, I overheard her speaking quietly to a friend, clearly shaken. "I don't understand," she said. "She is capable. She is confident. She is unstoppable." Her words weren't loud, but I heard them. And for the first time, I felt a sense of quiet triumph. I hadn't needed to yell, fight, or humiliate her. I simply reclaimed my own space, my own confidence, and my own life. That was enough. Meanwhile, my husband began noticing the undeniable changes too. He started consulting me more often, valuing my input, and even praising my strategic decisions. It was a subtle shift, but it reinforced what I had already known. My independence and competence could not be ignored. During this period, I also continued developing my side business. Each success outside the household became another proof point, not just for me, but for the family. The mother-in-law who once dismissed my abilities now found herself unable to deny the evidence, and every time she tried to interfere, I calmly countered with preparation and foresight. I had realized something profound. Empowerment isn't a single moment. It is the accumulation of countless small victories, the steady assertion of self-worth, and the unwavering refusal to let anyone else define your value. My mother-in-law's power had crumbled not because I fought her with anger, but because I refused to let fear, guilt, or doubt dictate my life. And as I stood in my quiet room one night, reflecting on the journey so far, I knew that the ultimate triumph was near. She could see my strength, but she could not undo it. I had built a life she could not enter, a life she could not control, and a life that had nothing to do with her approval. The cracks in her power were visible, and I was ready to transform them into complete liberation. By now, I had fully embraced the woman I was meant to be: strong, confident, and unafraid. But empowerment is never static. Just as the mother-in-law had once pushed me to my breaking point, life continued to test me, forcing me to adapt, grow, and assert myself even more. Chapter 8 was about cementing my independence not through confrontation, but through consistency, intelligence, and quiet authority. It started with the finances. For years, my mother-in-law had used money as a weapon, controlling the household budget, dictating every expense, and making me feel incapable of managing even the smallest amount. I knew that true independence meant taking control not arrogantly, but wisely. I approached the household accounts methodically, reviewing every expense, renegotiating unnecessary costs, and planning for savings and investments. Each move was strategic, backed by the knowledge I had gained from my father's letter and the lawyer's guidance. Slowly, I established a financial framework that was transparent, effective, and impossible for her to undermine. The first time she confronted me about the changes, I expected a battle. Instead, I remained calm, explained my reasoning with clarity, and presented the facts. Her face twisted in disbelief. How are you doing this?" she stammered. I smiled softly. "I've learned, observed, and prepared. It is not magic, it is planning." Beyond finances, I focused on building my personal life. I strengthened my friendships, expanded my professional network, and pursued opportunities my father had always envisioned for me. Each success was another brick in the foundation of the life I was creating, a life she could no longer touch or influence. At home, the atmosphere shifted completely. Where tension and fear once ruled, there was now a quiet acknowledgement of my competence. Relatives and family friends noticed the transformation. Comments of admiration replaced whispers of criticism. And though my mother-in-law still tried to assert control, her words now fell flat. She could no longer intimidate me, and that realization weighed heavily on her. The most significant moment came when she attempted one of her subtle manipulations, inviting me to handle a delicate family situation that she believed would expose my incompetence. I accepted the challenge calmly, analyzing every detail, preparing solutions, and anticipating every possible obstacle. When the moment arrived, I handled it flawlessly. Every relative involved praised my composure and judgment. My mother-in-law, who had intended to humiliate me, was left speechless, her plan completely backfiring. It was in that silence, the quiet shock on her face, that I realized the extent of my transformation. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I wasn't just proving her wrong. I was living a life she could never enter. My father's letter, the lawyer's guidance, and my own perseverance had turned years of pain into a life of dignity, independence, and strength. Even my husband, who had been silent or passive for so long, began recognizing my abilities. He started seeking my advice genuinely, not out of obligation, but out of respect for my intelligence and decision-making. It was a subtle change, but meaningful. I realized that empowerment wasn't about dominance. It was about creating respect that could not be challenged. As the weeks passed, I cemented routines that reflected my independence. I managed the household, built my side business, maintained professional growth, and cultivated a social circle that supported me. I had learned the most important lesson: no one could define my worth or control my destiny unless I allowed them to. And I had made it clear I would allow no one, not even the woman who once called me useless. That night, I sat alone in my room, reflecting on the journey. From trembling in fear to managing complex situations with ease, I had transformed. I had turned humiliation into strategy, fear into preparation, and manipulation into motivation. The cracks in my mother-in-law's power had widened into chasms, and I had learned that real power doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from preparation, confidence, and unwavering belief in oneself. I knew the ultimate resolution was still ahead, but I felt unstoppable. Every step I had taken, every small victory I had claimed, had built a life that was completely mine. And the best part? She could see it. She could feel it. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. By now, the cracks in my mother-in-law's power had become impossible to ignore. Her attempts to undermine me were no longer subtle, they were desperate. And I was ready. This was the moment where patience met opportunity, where planning turned into undeniable proof of my strength. It began one evening when she tried to orchestrate a meeting with the family to publicly shame me over a trivial household expense. She expected me to falter, to panic, to apologize, and prove her right. But I had anticipated this moment. Calmly, I prepared all the documents, evidence, and records I needed to defend myself. Every calculation, every receipt, every action was backed by meticulous planning. When the meeting began, she launched into her familiar barrage. "You don't know how to manage this family. You are careless, incompetent, and useless." Her words were sharp, meant to cut deep and humiliate. I took a deep breath, centered myself, and responded not with anger, but with facts. I've documented everything, carefully managed finances, and ensured transparency in every household decision, I said calmly, passing the records to the relatives. If there is any question about my ability or responsibility, you can see it all here. The room fell silent. Eyes shifted, brows furrowed, and murmurs of astonishment spread. Her confidence faltered. She tried to interject, tried to twist the facts, but I stayed composed. Each attempt she made to regain control was met with evidence and calm reasoning. She realized, finally, that her influence over the household and over me was gone. Then came the ultimate validation. The lawyer, who had been quietly present, read my father's secret letter aloud once more. His words reinforced my competence, my rights, and my place in the family. The mother-in-law's face went pale. She had tried to silence me for years, but the law, my father's trust, and my own preparation left her powerless. For the first time, she confronted the reality of my independence. Her voice trembled as she muttered, I never expected this. You've changed everything." I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My calm composure, backed by undeniable proof, was all the answer she needed. As the relatives looked on, I realized something profound. Empowerment doesn't require humiliation or revenge. It requires preparation, strategy, and an unwavering belief in oneself. Every insult, every attempt to belittle me, every act of manipulation had been transformed into fuel. I had used it to build a life she could never touch. Over the following weeks, the final shift in household dynamics became evident. My mother-in-law became noticeably subdued, her criticisms quieter, her manipulations less frequent. She had no choice but to acknowledge my competence, my authority, and the life I was building. Even my husband, who had remained passive for years, began to show genuine respect and admiration. By the end of this chapter, I had fully reclaimed my life. I was no longer living under the shadow of someone else's judgments or cruelty. I had turned fear into strategy, humiliation into empowerment, and manipulation into motivation. The woman who once called me useless could see, perhaps for the first time, that her power over me was gone forever. That night, I reflected quietly in my room. The journey had been long, painful, and filled with doubt, but I had emerged victorious not through anger, not through confrontation, but through resilience, planning, and self-belief. I had built a life of independence, dignity, and strength. And in that life, no one, not even the most relentless critic, could ever diminish me again. The months of struggle, planning, and quiet battles had finally led me to this moment. I was no longer the timid, powerless woman my mother-in-law once mocked. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my self-worth. It was about reflection, triumph, and the freedom that comes from knowing you built something truly your own. The house felt different now. The tension that had always hung in the air was gone. My mother-in-law had learned, quietly and reluctantly, that her words no longer held power over me. I moved through the rooms with calm assurance, making decisions, organizing events, and managing the household with a confidence that came from months of preparation and resilience. But the most profound change wasn't external, it was internal. I had spent so many years believing that I was useless, letting others define my worth. Now, I understood that empowerment is not about proving people wrong, it's about proving yourself right. It's about waking up each morning knowing that you have the ability, the strength, and the intelligence to navigate life on your own terms. I had built a life of independence. My small business flourished, my relationships with friends and mentors deepened, and even my husband began to recognize and respect the woman I had become. For the first time, I felt a sense of completeness, not because anyone else validated me, but because I finally believed in myself. One quiet evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. I remembered the first moment I felt fear, the first time my mother-in-law had scolded me, belittled me, and made me doubt my worth. I thought of every sleepless night, every tear, and every pang of humiliation. And I realized that every challenge had been a stepping stone, every insult had been fuel, and every doubt had been a spark for the fire I had now fully unleashed. The lawyer's role had been instrumental. My father's letter had guided me, his words validating my capabilities and giving me the courage to act. But ultimately, it was my perseverance, patience, and refusal to accept the limitations others imposed on me that had created the life I now lived. I had learned that strength is not loud or aggressive. True strength is calm, strategic, and resilient. It's about planning, preparation, and the quiet confidence to face challenges without fear. And as I looked around my home, organized, peaceful, and full of respect, I knew I had achieved that strength. The mother-in-law who once called me useless still lived under the same roof, but her power over me was gone. She could see my independence, my confidence, and the life I had built. And there was nothing she could do to take it away. I didn't gloat, and I didn't seek revenge. The ultimate victory was my freedom, the knowledge that I was finally living life on my own terms. As I sat alone that night, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for my father's foresight, for the lawyer's guidance, and for the inner strength that had carried me through years of doubt and humiliation. But most of all, I felt gratitude for myself for refusing to be defined by someone else's cruelty, for embracing my own power, and for building a life that no one could ever take away. I had turned every tear, every insult, every act of manipulation into a life of purpose, independence, and respect. I was no longer useless. I was unstoppable. And I knew, with unwavering certainty, that this was just the beginning of a life that I truly deserved, one filled with dignity, success, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had claimed my rightful place in the world. The journey had been painful, but it had been worth every step. And as I closed my eyes that night, I whispered softly to myself, I built the life I deserve, and no one can ever take it from me.